topic if you want to. I mean, no, please stand if you prefer, but can I welcome everybody here this evening to Committee Room 10 of the House of Commons. My name is Siobhan McDonough, and I am Senior Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tamils. We're here, as you know, to mark International Enforced Disappearance Day. Our speaker is Andrew Iannucci. A brief overview of MAP's work, particularly looking at enforced disappearances and action against Jagat Jayasuriya.
So the MAP, the Monitoring and Accountability Panel for Sri Lanka, was established at the end of 2015 as an independent body to provide monitoring, advice and recommendations on the progress of transitional justice in Sri Lanka, particularly from a victim's perspective, including and especially the hoped-for judicial mechanism to bring to trial alleged perpetrators. The MAP's members are legal practitioners with expertise in various national and international criminal justice mechanisms designed to address wartime atrocities. So as I'm sure you're aware, in October 2015, the UN Human Rights Council passed its Resolution 30/1, and that has been the fundamental sort of roadmap for what has meant to have been a transitional justice process in Sri Lanka. And that was made up of 4 pillars, which some of you have probably heard of these hoped-for institutions. Number 1, an Office on Missing Persons, which exists but has not yet been operationalized, an Office on Reparations, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and a special court. Notably, with respect to that last pillar, the special court, the government had initially agreed to the participation of some international actors. However, there was almost immediate backtracking on that, and that is one of the issues that the MAP feels very strongly about, that if there is to be a special court in Sri Lanka, it should include at least some international participation along the models that have been, the hybrid models that have been conducted elsewhere, particularly in Sierra Leone and Cambodia. So just to recap, we periodically put out reports on the progress of the process, but usually they're reports on lack of progress because very little has happened. We put out our last comprehensive report in February of this year in advance of the last Human Rights Council resolution extending the time to live up to the commitments by another 2 years. And so just before that, our major grievances were, number 1, that the government appeared to lack any political will whatsoever to implement these promised pillars. Number 2, that the government itself continued to commit human rights abuses and failed to make necessary reforms to the security and justice sectors of the country. The government has maintained its militarization and illegal occupation of large portions of the north and east of the country, as you know. Office of Missing Persons, as I mentioned, had been established by law, but had yet to go into effect. And finally, that the government had cynically rejected the recommendations of the so-called Consultation Task Force. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. That was a countrywide effort to gauge the views of Sri Lankans on their views as to what should happen. So, as I said, despite these failings, in March, the Human Rights Council gave the government an additional 2 years to move forward with what we can only expect at the moment to be further stalling. The process is up for review again in the early part of 2018. There is a Human Rights Council session beginning next week. Sri Lanka is not on the agenda, but as I understand it, there will be several side events organized. So I don't know, some of you might be there, but there'll be some things to attend. So since the extension was granted in March, we've been keeping track of progress, or lack of progress, as I should say, and we put out a press release recently highlighting again what has not happened. So I'll just quickly go through that. There was mention earlier of a report by Amnesty International focusing on the victims and and their relatives. And just to quote again from part of that report, the conclusion was that these people have been obstructed at every turn, misled about the whereabouts or the fate of their disappeared relatives, subjected to threats, smears, and intimidation, and suffered the indignity of delayed trials and stalled truth and justice processes. In May, the government put out a new piece of legislation called the Counterterrorism Act, which was meant to replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which I suspect everyone is familiar with, has been a long-standing piece of legislation which has been used by the government to terrorize the population. That was one of the commitments the government made to repeal that. What has been offered as a replacement has been heavily criticized. And according to Human Rights Watch, and I quote, Sri Lanka's latest counterterrorism bill falls far short of the government's pledges to the United Nations Human Rights Council to end abusive detention without charge, and would still permit many of the abuses occurring under the PTA while raising a number of new concerns, including broad and vague definitions of terrorist acts, warrantless arrests, and undue limitations on freedom of expression. In June of this year, the government announced the creation of a special committee to coordinate and oversee the justice mechanisms. However, it was very vague and nobody's entirely clear if that office has been set up. More worrying still, in July, a UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism, Mr. Ben Emerson, a British lawyer himself, wrote a report about findings he had made based on some research he had done, and I'll quote, Sri Lanka continues to use torture against people detained on national security grounds, and its progress on human rights reforms and justice remains woefully slow. According to his research, all the evidence points to the fact that the use of torture was routine and endemic against people held under the deeply flawed PTA, that's the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Unsurprisingly, the Tamil community has borne the brunt of the state's well-oiled torture apparatus, and the laws used disproportionately against them. It was reported to Mr. Emerson that up to 80% of suspects arrested under the anti-terrorism legislation since in 2016 have reported torture and other physical ill treatment. He will be presenting those findings officially to the Human Rights Council again, but not until March of next year. Just to mention one more time, the Office of Missing Persons was officially gazetted by President Sirisena, but again, nothing has happened and nobody is quite sure if anything will happen. Previously, the MAP in particular has been critical of that for the same reasons that the Honorable MP mentioned. There are provisions in that law giving a kind of immunity to perpetrators. So we're quite concerned about that. Also, the International Truth and Justice Project, which is the organization that spearheaded the recent case against Jayasuriya, issued a report and documented 21 new cases of abduction, illegal detention, torture, and/or sexual violence against Tamil victims in 2016-2017. And that's, well, and going back to, we feel like we're beating a dead horse on this, but the government initially, as I said, made a commitment to an international justice mechanism with international participation, and they have vocally distanced themselves from that original position. So, in light of these developments, we have recently called on the government to criminalize enforced disappearances as a matter of urgency, operationalize the Office of Missing Persons as soon as possible, ensure its independence, and consider the amendments in line with the recommendations that we made about the shortcomings that we've identified. We'd like the government to repeal the PTA as soon as possible and replace it with something that is up to international standards, not the current draft that's on the table. And we'd like the government to begin taking some steps to put in place some kind of a justice mechanism, some kind of a hybrid court, some kind of a tribunal, so that cases can actually be brought in Sri Lanka. Although we're not very hopeful that that's going to happen. Getting to the point of enforced disappearances, as mentioned, Sri Lanka has ratified the convention. However, they've done very little else, apart from signing and ratifying. What needs to be done, as mentioned already, is legislation needs to be put in place, steps need to be taken, cases need to be brought, all those kinds of things. None of that has been done. And in terms of those obligations under that convention, the convention dates back to 2010, and it was signed in 2016, but the principles, the legal principles that undergird the convention are principles of customary international law. So these are not new issues. It's not, the government can't say, oh, well, we've only just signed this, we can only use it prospectively going forward to take care of cases. These are some issues of customary international law, which puts obligations on the state to prosecute. And I won't repeat the finding or the quotes that were already made about the working group on enforced disappearances, but in that report, in one of those UN reports, one of the cases in particular that stood out was the case of Father Francis Joseph, who was, towards the end of the war, seen by several witnesses as surrendering and turning over some LTT fighters who had laid down their arms, hors de combat, as we say, were no longer fighting. These people were seen by many witnesses to be rounded up by the army, taken away, and disappeared. And that is one of the central bases of the case that was mentioned already against General Jayasuriya. So that case, I think, we think, the MAP thinks, because of the lack of progress, because it's quite clear the government is not going to be setting up a tribunal anytime soon, we fully support that kind of initiative. Clearly that case will have been brought under something called universal jurisdiction, which places a burden on any state to prosecute perpetrators of very serious human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, including enforced disappearances. So we certainly commend that. We'd like to see more of that. And that is something that the High Commissioner for Human Rights has called upon himself for other states and organizations to do. So we will be putting out a more comprehensive report on that and some alternative justice mechanisms in the coming weeks. And we will keep you posted, and you can always check our website for more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for that very detailed and very interesting report back on your work. Our next speaker is, as you can tell, is not Aaron, who many of us know from Bernburg, but is Antonia Benfield, who will be just addressing her company, who has been doing an enormous amount of work for Tamils over a very, very long period of time, and who I have often, in situations of great distress with constituents in terrible positions, gone to ask for support. And on behalf of my constituents, I'm really grateful to Bernburg for all the work that you've done.
Siobhan, thank you. I'm going to address just briefly whether, in the light of the current situation in Sri Lanka, the country is capable of handling justice and accountability internally. The current human rights situation in Sri Lanka is well known to all of us, but it's fair to say that even after the change of government in January 2015, the human rights situation hasn't improved. As has already been addressed by Andrew, the Prevention of Terrorism Act remains in force. And this is a huge feature in enforced disappearance cases because, of course, it provides for administrative detention over lengthy periods, incommunicado and secret detention. So really the two issues go hand in hand, and that is why putting pressure on the Sri Lankan government to repeal and replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act is an important feature of progress. As I've said, despite the change in government, we're seeing repeated instances of detention, torture, ill treatment, and sexual violence. Dozens of cases, of course, have been reported recently by the International Truth and Justice Project, and their research is probably well known to many of you. In a sense, the patterns of ill treatment mirror that has occurred previously under Rajapaksa. So really to say that there is no change, there is no positive development, it is supported by reliable evidence. In addition, in Sri Lanka, witnesses who have testified against state actors are themselves at risk of intimidation, unlawful killing and violence. As Together Against Genocide have reported, many witnesses and their families have been targeted. Their report, Sri Lanka's Silenced Witnesses and Victims, demonstrates that Sri Lanka is a continuing unsafe place for witnesses. To summarise really the expectations of Sri Lankan survivors, it's fair to say that the majority of victims of political crimes in Sri Lanka are Tamils. Of course, there are historical issues of enforced disappearances back in the 80s and 90s for Sinhalese Sri Lankans, but in present-day Sri Lanka, it really is a focus for the Tamil community. Some Tamil survivors, of course, continue to remain in the country, but over the period 2008 or 9 to the present, over 40,000 survivors have sought asylum abroad and are therefore outside of the country. For those who are still within Sri Lanka, there are clear indicators that the population requires internal accountability. Of course, in the 2015 elections, the Tamil National Alliance saw huge support from the Tamil population. And of course, part of their manifesto was a pledge to push for international accountability mechanisms. In the Sri Lankan diaspora, of course, Tamil survivors who have fled have continuously been calling through the TGT and other organisations for international accountability. And this has been widely documented by Freedom from Torture, Together Against Genocide and the International Truth and Justice Project. Tamil victims are deeply disappointed by the UN resolution of 2015. As has been mentioned previously by Andrew, again, there is a deep scepticism about statements that have been made by the Sri Lankan government. And there are serious misgivings among many people, the majority of people, it would be fair to say, about proposed domestic mechanisms moving forward. So far, nothing's been done about the UN resolution, as has been addressed already. The international convention that should provide protection for all people against enforced disappearances has been signed and ratified by the Sri Lankan government, but there is no domestic legislation. There is essentially no way forward for individuals internally to rely upon a domestic criminal offence to bring perpetrators to justice. Tamil victims, of course, therefore need to turn to the international community, as is being done here today, to push their own governments to essentially put pressure on the Sri Lankan government to facilitate effective prosecutions. And really, at the current state, that is the only way forward. As I've stated, there is intense scepticism about the current position in Sri Lanka, and an example that's been cited already is the issue that we've seen in terms of public statements that have been made by President Sirisena about the former army commander Jayasuriya. And as has been touched on already, it was publicly said by President Sirisena that he would not bring Jayasuriya or any other war hero before the International Criminal Court or a war crimes tribunal. Now, when one considers that alongside the evidence that's been put forward or summarised by Minister Fonseca, who said that there is clear evidence that Jayasuriya has committed enforced disappearances and war crimes, there is clear concern and scepticism that, of course, individuals will be allowed to act with impunity and essentially get away with what has been a historical and concerning pattern of crimes against humanity. Another example of essentially denial and impunity in Sri Lanka at present is the former foreign minister Mangala Samarira, who failed to acknowledge ongoing violations taking place since the Sirisena government came to power in 2015. Now, when we go back to consider the strong findings that have been made by many organisations, International Truth and Justice Project is one, the investigations that have been conducted by Ben Emerson that Andrew mentioned is another, it is deeply concerning that someone speaking on behalf of the government is denying that such atrocities are taking place. Crucially, in terms of accountability, the former foreign minister failed to specify whether international crimes will be retroactively incorporated into trial mechanisms. So essentially it's unknown whether there will be any way to challenge historical offences. Essentially all indicators are that the Sri Lankan government refuses to take international advice and guidance, and that on the current position it is unlikely that accountability will be achieved or people will be held to account. Now, in conclusion, what that means is that there is a systematic change required in Sri Lanka. There is a need to dismantle what are entrenched structures of repression, torture, and sexual violence. Enforced disappearances are something that must be addressed. The ability for state actors to act with impunity and carry out killings, essentially for which they can't be held to account, cannot at present and the near future be dealt with by Sri Lanka internally. Essentially what that means is that members of the security forces who are complicit in torture and sexual violence need to be screened and removed from what is a systematic structure that allows for torture and enforced disappearance with impunity. Hence, what is needed really is a call to the UK government and other national governments to push for international accountability, both in terms of mechanisms to bring individuals to account and prosecutions. And that's clearly a call that is brought to the UK government on behalf of Tamil survivors collectively. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. That was really, really helpful and some food for thought about what the all-party parliamentary group can be doing in the next few weeks and months.